This is a slightly remixed version of a presentation I made to the Geography Teacher Educators Conference in January 2021 titled, Can We Represent People and Place Without Misrepresenting Them? The Ethics of Case Study Writing. Two of the most fundamental concepts to geography are space and place, and the definition of place is space with meaning attached to it. But then, of course, because we attach meaning to place, there is an obvious question that emerges almost immediately when we start to consider these concepts. Whose place are we talking about? Which meaning? Which sets of meaning? I've chosen orange and green here for reasons that will become apparent in a moment to represent the country that I come from, Northern Ireland, because there are at least two traditions in Northern Ireland, Protestant, Catholic, Nationalist, Unionist, however you want to label them, orange and green, at least two sets of stories and understandings of place. So we can come here to the city of Derry, or should that be Londonderry? Even the name of it is contested and disputed. And this is now one of the major tourist attractions, Free Derry Corner. This gable wall of a building of terraced houses now remains, and people come here to visit it in order to get their photographs taken. But this, if we go back into the 1970s, was the gable wall of terraced houses. What does this photograph represent to you? Well, there are at least two narratives here in Northern Ireland of a photograph like this. This is either a symbol of British imperialist, colonialist presence and a heavily militarised one, and the people in the background are saying, we reject your colonial presence here. You're entering Free Derry, it says. Well, really, you're entering at your own risk. Another interpretation could say that what is happening in the background there is a place of lawlessness, a breeding ground of terrorist insurrection, and the Crown British forces are perfectly entitled to protect themselves against the threats that they face in there as they go in and restore law and order to this part of the United Kingdom. Two very, very different stories, two very, very different interpretations of space. And yet, we don't need to look at this in even such a militaristic way to examine and explore the way in which that manifests itself in Northern Ireland even today. This is the town that I teach in. This is Lurgan. It's like many other small, large market towns across Northern Ireland, and in many ways it looks reasonably normal. However, if you dig down beneath the veneer of normality, you see this map here of the census of the population here, showing how divided the town is. Lurgan is one of the most divided towns in the whole of Northern Ireland. The black line here represents the mental map line that our pupils drew in terms of where they perceive to be the division across the town. And in fact, that mental map, that mental line represents better than the census ward data where that division actually is. And it shows that very real sense and perception of the different types of space and place in the town of Lurgan. And this is manifested in physical and literal ways at different parts of the town, where the symbolism is very strong in terms of representing one side of the community or the other. And into this context then, over the past couple of years, we have taken our geographers on a field trip as part of our shared education cross-community programme. Students from the school that I teach in, Lurgan College, the junior high that feeds into our school, Lurgan Junior High, and the Catholic school in the town, St. Ronan's. You can see the different uniforms represented here. And we take them around different places in the town, and we allow them then to use the Survey 123 app with ArcGIS, which allows them to capture some of their data and their perceptions and their feelings of how they perceive the town. And whenever we did this, we captured it and collected it together onto this map. So I want to take a quick look at how this map can represent people's different perceptions of space and place. So if we come down even just into one of the survey areas that we visited, this is in the Protestant area, and we came down to this particular location. This is a 13 to 14-year-old female from St. Ronan's. And if we scroll down here, this is what she said. I feel uncomfortable as I've never been here before and would like not to come again. But if we go on to take a look at one of the junior high students, which is a largely Protestant school, A young boy says this: I come here every once in a while to play football and stuff with my mates, so I'm pretty familiar with this location. So what you clearly see here is this difference in perception, this difference in representation of place that exists between the students in the two communities. In fact, it's not just the two communities that represents that difference. I mean, you can start to carve up that difference looking at a variety of other different factors that will influence their perception of place as well. And once you start to run it through here, you see that those different variables and those different factors will determine and influence how the pupils responded. But it's not just those factors as well, because to suggest that there are Protestant and Catholic as representing two monolithic groups is to oversimplify again. In reality, you could slice this down in that way as well. And what we found through the survey that we did was that the perception of place was extremely complex, nuanced, subtle, and it led to some absolutely fascinating conversations that were going on with the pupils about how they perceived place. So it turns out that there aren't just two stories, two perceptions of place, that there are many, many stories and perceptions of place. And you can become increasingly fine-grained as you start to drill down about the perceptions that different groups have. In fact, if you take this to its most logical conclusion, you might want to say, well, to be perfectly honest, we're all individuals here, and all of us will have an individual history, individual experience, individual life experiences that will determine what our perception of place will be. So in actual fact, what you need to do is represent this down to the level of the individual. You need just to capture the story. Now, I think story is very powerful. I think it's a very powerful tool to tell perceptions of place. But I want to reject that ultimately postmodern view that you have to atomize this to the level of the individual, because I think the danger of that is this. Because if you can't say everything about a location, then you can't say anything about it. And I want to reject that because I think it is important that we are able to generalize. I think it is important for us as geographers to be looking for trends and for patterns. But yet we need to be careful that we don't overgeneralize, or to ask the question like this: how do we represent without misrepresenting? Where does the balance lie? Let me ask this question. Let's play a game of word association, or place word association. I say to you Belfast. What comes to mind? I wonder, did an image like this come to mind? I wonder, is this what you associate with Belfast? The particular images that seem to come across in the news a lot that represent the city that I grew up in. And yet even in this headline, we notice a little bit of a hint that that is only part of the story, because apparently underneath all of this writing, normal life does go on. There's a 50% suit sale at SD Kells in Bedford Street in Belfast. But I wonder why an image like this didn't come to mind whenever you think of Belfast. Belfast, geologically speaking, is absolutely fascinating. What you're looking at here is Cave Hill. This is the edge of the Antrim Plateau, one of the largest lava plateaus in the whole of Europe, and it is an absolutely incredible place of this amazing sense of geological history. And this is McCart's Fort. So looking over the top, there's a real sense of the human history here as well, and the lights of the city down below. This is also known colloquially as Napoleon's Nose, because from a certain angle, it looks like you're looking at the side of the face of a prone giant carved into the edge of the Antrim Plateau. And it was said, of course, to inspire the writing of Gulliver's Travels. So there are many, many more aspects to the city of Belfast than just those headlines that come through. And of course that reminds us of this well-used phrase now, the danger of a single story. And the single story creates stereotypes, and the problems with them is not that they're untrue, but they are incomplete. The one story becomes the only story. So if those are some of the complexities of representing place and the various meanings that can be attached to it, how do we as geography teachers, when we're considering exploring place with our pupils, overcome them? Well, one of the ways that is becoming increasingly popular these days is what's called, and can be referred to as a helicoidal curriculum. It's a spiral curriculum that's pulled out in a more helix-shaped form. And the idea behind it is that if you're going to study one country like Guatemala, you don't just study it once, you study it through various topics, so that the pupils then end up with a little bit more of a sense of the place that is broader and more rounded, and it's not just a single story. Now, I think there's a lot to this as an approach, so I don't want to be overly critical of it. But when you've been kicking around geography classrooms as long as I have, it does give you a little bit of perspective in this. Back in the 1980s, whenever I was in school myself as a pupil, this was the textbook I used. Now, you can ask yourself, was this the hairstyle I sported as well? No comment, but this was certainly the textbook I used. Geography of the British Isles, and I remember flicking through it in colour, how exciting that was, to be able to look at places like the Lake District and hill forming in the Lake District. And this was regional geography. It was all about telling the breadth of story of one particular location. I then went to university, did my teacher training, came to be a teacher in the 1990s, and Stevenson's book was no longer around. It was replaced by WAF. Did you use this book in school? Did you sport Curtin's hairstyle in the 1990s? Oh, definitely not. But I did use David Wolff, the systematic geography approach. And in those 4 years, from when I left school to when I became a teacher, the pendulum had swung. Regional geography or systematic geography. Now, of course, the truth is that it's not one or the other. Regional geography brings systemized, generalized points out from it, and systematic geography needs to be recontextualized into regions or places. So there is a balance to be struck with this. But it makes me think that perhaps the spiral curriculum or the helicoidal curriculum will not necessarily address all of the issues of misrepresentation of place, because I don't think it would be healthy for it to go right the way back into regional geography. So how then do we resolve this, particularly if we are dealing with a case study where we are really only visiting it once? This is from the A-level specification that I teach, see it in Northern Ireland. And the spatial context requirement here is a single case study, volcanic activity. Now, what happens if the best volcano case study happens to be in a country that it doesn't really suit for me to explore in detail elsewhere? What if that is the case? Now, there's just one other slight aside that I want to notice here in the way through. The illustration I give is Mount Pinatubo, 1991. I want to consider for a moment about the choice and the date of the case study as well. This is one of the most iconic images of the Mount Pinatubo eruption. If you've taught this at all, you have probably used this image. It is so graphic and powerful in terms of what it demonstrates of the utter devastation and threat of a pyroclastic flow. So there's an argument to be said that we choose the case studies that are the most appropriate for helping us to deliver the best geography that we can. Yes, it would be good to have them up to date if we could, but we need to have them representing the best understanding of the processes that are going on. And enough time not just for this to be reported in the news, but for academic research to be conducted. Enough time to pass to look not just at the short-term impacts, but the long-term impacts. There's an argument for that. And yet, 1991, the photograph that you're looking at here was taken 3 years, I think, before the photograph that I'm about to show you. 1994, the premiere of Friends as a sitcom, one of the most popular sitcoms in the world, still running reruns all around the world today, still streaming probably every single day into many households across the world. And yet, 1994 is quite a while ago. What do these guys look like now? Oh, sorry, Matthew, sorry. Could have picked on anybody. It does quite show how dated this is. So maybe there's an argument that says, no, we need to be slightly more contemporary than this in terms of the place representation. Well, okay, I will say this though. The historical context matters. The Mount Pinatubo eruption in 1991 was the first major eruption after the Nevada del Ruiz eruption in Colombia in 1985. Now, why does that matter? Because the Colombia eruption in Nevada del Ruiz devastated Armero, a town by a lahar, a mudflow that came out and had an absolutely devastating impact. 22,000 people were killed. Now, in 1985, I was a secondary school pupil. I actually remember this story playing out live. And there is also an argument that says that we should be showing contemporary events to the pupils that we're teaching, because these events play out live. There is an immediacy to them. And particularly in our globalized world today, we can connect with these tragic stories and be moved by them in a very, very profound way. And yet part of the tragedy of this eruption in Nevada del Ruiz was that the volcanologists and their hazard maps were very accurate in terms of the location of the lahars. They knew that Armero was at risk. VEI-3 is not a particularly huge volcanic eruption, and yet 22,000 people died, even though the hazard maps were reasonably accurate. The next big test then came in Pinatubo in 1991 in the Philippines. VEI-6, a much bigger eruption, and yet the death total was much, much lower. So there is an interesting historical question. What happened in between? And what happened in between was in part the volcanologists being completely shocked by the failures of not necessarily their predictions, but the reactions of the authorities to their predictions that led to the tragedy of Armero. And so they went in the next few years on an education trip around the world, trying to go to people in these areas which were much more vulnerable to volcanic eruptions, with a videotape of a lahar, of a pyroclastic flow, just showing them what these things could be and the impacts that they could have. That historical context is important. So in a sense, history matters. But at the same time, 1991 just felt like an increasingly long way away. It just felt like for the 17 and 18-year-olds that I would be teaching this to, was there not something that I could show them and teach them that was a little bit more up to date? Which brought me then to 2018, Volcan de Fuego in Guatemala. I had, of course, noticed this on the way past, but I didn't really know anything much about Volcan de Fuego or indeed Guatemala. I've never studied it, I've never visited it, and I didn't really know why this tragedy unfolded there in any great length. But it seemed to me to be a useful way of going in and asking that question. Why was it that all these years later people seem to be caught out by this pyroclastic flow? So although the historical context matters, we do need to reflect the advances since then. And indeed, as I studied and researched this case study, it became very clear to me that there had been significant scientific advances in terms of how volcanologists and the authorities were responding to these hazards. Mount Pinatubo did not give me a chance to reflect these, and I needed to. Here's one particular example. Dr. Eliza Calder from the University of Edinburgh worked with NCIVMA, who's the scientific monitoring organisation in Guatemala, to produce these secondary lahar hazard maps that needed to be produced rapidly and quickly in order to inform the people of the potential risk, particularly given the climate in this area, which was made it very vulnerable to rain. And this was communicated through a 3D GIS map that was disseminated quickly and readily to the people in the hazard areas. It didn't exist in 1991. It's important that the students know that. The use of remote sensing technology, of how the satellites were able to be tasked with trying to aid the rescue attempts on the ground, and how that modern work of remote sensing and the damage proxy maps, the DPMs, and how they're used. Again, these kinds of things were not being used in 1991 in Pinatubo. It is important that they needed to know these. So there's a slight aside about the timing nature of this, and that was part of the reason why I wanted to bring something a little bit more up to date. Back to the spec. The spec asks us to look at that case study, but the key word here is to evaluate. Now that's, I think, one of the core skills that we can encourage our geographers to pick up. We are people that are happy to work within the complexities and the grey areas of the real world when decisions are not clear cut and black and white. We're very happy to be able to deal with those and try to approach those in a way that explores and weighs up evidence. I love a good evaluation as a geographer. So I would say to my pupils, evaluate, time to weigh up the frozen prawns. Of course, always gives me a chance to crack my old really sad dad joke. Hold on, Mr. Hamill, did you just say frozen prawns? I said, why would I say frozen prawns? I said pros and cons. Anyway, whatever you need to do to get it into their head, it's looking at those two sides of the argument. Now, the problem with an evaluate approach sometimes, however, is it can end up becoming quite simplistic. Here's something positive, here's something negative, therefore overall to a certain extent. Well, that's an evaluation, but it's a bit bland. When you look at the mark schemes for the A-level exam, they word it in a very interesting way. Candidates may use a variety of structured answers to address this question. For example, evaluations may run through the answer, or they may be summative. In other words, it gives us the freedom in our evaluations to be more interesting. So what I really wanted to do with my pupils was to move them away from a simplistic, here's a positive, here's a negative, therefore, to a certain extent. Positive, negative, therefore, nah. I want my pupils to be more passionate about the geography they study. I want them to engage in it. I want them to have strong views and opinions. So I was encouraging them to be interesting. Can we go beyond simply the bland, positive, negative, therefore, nah? Can we really make value judgments about what went on? Can we, in other words, really understand this case study a lot better? And yet, the counter to that, the other side of that, is that we need to be fair. I think in particular, if you're going to be interesting, if you're going to take strong positions in something, there's the danger that you can misrepresent. I've certainly seen this in terms of Northern Ireland, whenever people are looking in from the outside at what's going on and don't really understand the subtleties and the nuances of this place, which is understandable. Even those of us that live here very often don't understand them. But the misrepresentation that can take place very often feels like caricature. It's not a fair representation. So can we be interesting and be fair at the same time? Well, in terms of being interesting, this was my attempt, my approach at it. These were the statements that I was making. Rather than just putting something positive, something negative, I took a very strong position on some of these things. Now, let's explore just one of these in particular. The impacts of the eruption revealed that the risks to locals was more of a function of societal vulnerability, simply than the hazards themselves. That statement gave us a tremendous opportunity to explore some really interesting aspects of the society in Guatemala and how that amplified the risk. Let's take a look at this. So interesting, yes, a lot to say there, but at the same time I needed to be fair, especially if I was going to be taking these strong positions. And actually the contemporary nature of this made me feel that compulsion even more. It was funny as I started to reflect on this, that the fact that Pinatubo happened in 1991 disconnected me a little bit from the people that were involved in it, and I just felt perhaps less of an obligation to treat them as fairly as maybe I ought to. And I felt much more of that obligation when dealing with something that was much more contemporary for me. But how do you be fair? So we're going to finish off by taking a look at some of the ways in which I've tried to do that, and I'll give you some tips that might inform you in your own case study writing. Here comes the first one. Go to the primary sources. Now, inevitably, when you start to research something like this, if you go onto Google and start Googling things, you'll be taken in the first instance to news articles. They tend to come further up the Google search hit list. And these can be, of course, tremendous places to start. The only problem is that they're secondary sources. They are based on interpretations of what other people say. The good news is that in this day and age that Twitter exists, it's relatively easy to find people that are actually there on the ground. And as I started to tweet about this and interact on Twitter, I quickly was able to make contact with some of these folks that are actually volcanologists that are working out in the area. And if you take a look at that list at the bottom there, not only Western people working in Guatemala, but William Jignat down at the bottom there, who is a local who works for Conred, the disaster management organisation that's out there. People that I was able to go directly to who know this place, who are working there, who are working with the locals, who are actually our locals. Such a rich way of getting access to this information that exists because of this contemporary event that I was looking at. And one of the things that allowed for was fact-checking. In a world where people have had enough of experts, truth matters, fact-checking matters. Now, this was a relatively small point that I was making. I got this from a newspaper source or a news source online. There were only 4 temporary volcanologists were available to monitor the volcanoes in Guatemala. Matthew was able to come in and say to me, no, that's not quite right. There was one that was there. A couple others were brought on in rolling contracts and temporary rolling contracts with no holidays and pensions. Now, those kinds of things are important to get the facts right. And being able to go to the primary sources for that enabled me really to have my work checked over like that. The second point is this: be open to critique. Now, you've already seen from what's just happened a hint of that. There were 2 in particular that I asked to critique this for me, Emma Lou and Matthew Watson, who both very kindly agreed to go over my draft with a fine-tooth comb and not only fact check it, but actually opinion check it. Now, I will admit that I did this with a degree of nervousness. It has been quite a while since I handed in something to a university lecturer to get them to assess it, and it was quite apprehensive to wait to see what was coming back. But it was so worth it, because not just that fact-checking, but if we're evaluating here, if we're going to take positions on this, if we're going to make value judgments, it's so vital for me that my perceptions from afar, even though they're as informed as I was trying to make them be, that they're checked by people who have direct local experience. It's the same kind of thing of people misrepresenting Northern Ireland. If they speak to any of us that come from here, we now may not be able to explain all the intricacies of what happens here, but we'll certainly be able to say to them, as we would say here in Northern Ireland, wind your neck in, mate. That's no way representing what's going on. And I got that critique coming in, which gave me much more confidence when I was being interesting in the evaluation points that I was making. Now, there's lots that I could say to illustrate that and the process that went on, but let me just take one example here, which probably was one of the most meaningful ones for me. I've already mentioned in CIVIMA, which is the scientific organisation that oversees the monitoring of disasters, of weather and natural disasters in Guatemala. Conred is the disaster management organisation. Now, this was one little statement that I put in. The limited communication network, especially the poor remote villages, meant that officials from Conred had little time to travel to the villages to warn the people. Now, I tried to be subtle in that. I tried where I was making these statements not to over-egg them so much that they would be misrepresented if they had little time to travel. I'm trying here not to say the Conred utterly failed, although some locals are debating that. There's a lot of debate about whether Conred's responses were appropriate or not. And I was trying not to overly criticise them. And yet Matthew made an incredibly profound point in what I was saying here. Again, he said more nuance required. The only official in Los Lotes, that's that village where the hundreds died, was from Conred. He was killed trying to evacuate children from his truck. Now that pulled me up short. That's the kind of local information that only somebody who has been there, has worked with that, is going to know and be able to communicate. And yet that's so important that I communicate this kind of thing to my students as we're doing this. So, you can see here in the quote that I got from the tweet how I then address this. Indeed, one of the officials from Conrad who made it, Los Lotes, was killed trying to evac children in his truck. Now, it's just that one sentence in the notes. Of course, when I was going over this with the pupils, I was able to tell them much more of the story. And as we continued, as I said in the tweet, our Vulcan de Fuego case study with sixth form today, it seemed fitting to pause in the midst of our discussion of the systemic issues to remember the individual acts of bravery and sacrifice that often go unnoticed in the wider world, represented by this single sentence. There's a power to that. There is something absolutely, utterly compelling for us as we sit down and think about these things. But the story continued because Ilse Naismith, one of the other volcanologists that I'd connected with, knew the man's name. Juan Fernando Galindo. A very kind man and a tragic loss. Thank you so much for giving me his name, I said to Ilse. We took a moment to remember him in class. To have this name will add so much more poignancy to this. When someone's name is mentioned, they are not truly forgotten. And I think these kinds of things are important for the students as they're learning the factual information. These scientists that are working out here, obviously out there primarily in a scientific mission, but they're connecting with the locals. They're making relationships and friendships with the locals. This is ultimately a human story, and to humanize it like this through the connections that I made with these volcanologists just made for such a powerful addition to it. The third point that I would make is to engage in world building. This is coming back again to the danger of a single story in Guatemala. So again, let me give you one illustration of that. When we looked at societal vulnerability of some of the people living in areas like Los Lotes, it was important to make the point that these villages were populated by poorer locals. So there was a socio-economic vulnerability, but they were also relocated there due to the Civil War. The people had these strong perceptions that they were moved there, not because this was a safe area, but because, surprise, surprise, the land closer to the volcano was safe or was cheaper. So there was just that one mention of the Civil War. That's all they got in their notes. But what was important for me was to give them a little bit of background context to this. It's important that the students knew that that Civil War that lasted for 36 years claimed the lives of over 200,000 civilians. It also is important for them to know that 83% of them were from Mayan Indian farmers. There was an ethnic dimension to this. So the vulnerability here represented not only socioeconomic poverty, but it also represented ethnic discrimination. These are important parts of world building. Now, there are other things that we looked at, like the tectonic setting. We looked also at the climate, because of the nature of the climate meant that they were very vulnerable to rainfall and things like this. But there was an opportunity as I was teaching this to go beyond what was in the notes, to give them this sense of the place, so that this wasn't just that one single story that we were looking at. And the final point is a very simple and straightforward point. And if you know me at all, of course, you'll know that I would be looking always for ways of doing this, is to use GIS to embed the story in location. There's so much information available for GIS maps for this in a way that the Pinatubo eruption just simply doesn't have. And for me then to be able to take these layers and all of this information and to put this onto a GIS map to allow the pupils then to look at this at various aspects of scale, to come in and explore it and really get a sense of the place through this was important as well. So those were my attempts then to be both interesting, to go beyond just bland, something positive, something negative, therefore meh, to actually train my students in the power and the skills of being able to evaluate deeply and richly, to take strong evidence-based positions in something, but yet at the same time to be fair, to go to the primary sources, to be open to critique, to engage in world building, and to use GIS to embed story and location. So, can we represent people in place without misrepresenting? It's tough. I do believe that just because we can't say everything, that doesn't mean we can't say anything. And there is an ethical component to this, to get this as right as possible, to be as fair as possible. But I hope that this little example, this case study of a case study, has given you some insight as to if you feel yourself the responsibility to represent places well. This will give you some ideas as to how you might go about doing it.